Why is it so hot? A worldwide heat wave is setting new records and causing deaths and wildfires. The scorching temperatures show no sign of falling. So apart from climate change, what is the cause? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle, Carey. Temperatures in Europe are soaring close to their highest ever. 48 degrees Celsius is the current record set in the Greek capital Athens back in 1977. This weekend's continental heat wave is expected to smash that all-time high. Hot air from Africa is baking Spain and Portugal and the Iberian peninsula. Record-breaking temperatures have been recorded in 8 Portuguese towns, and there's a widespread red alert for wildfires. In Spain, heat stroke killed at least 3 men. Heat wave warnings have been issued in 41 of the 50 Spanish provinces where temperatures are expected to soar to 44 degrees. Many other European countries are also suffering unusually extended periods of very hot weather. Dutch people are sweltering in their longest ever recorded heat wave. Water shortages are beginning in the Netherlands. Temperatures in France have surpassed 40 degrees for the first time this summer. Large parts of the country are on heat wave alert, and the media is raising awareness of the dangers. Sweden had its hottest July in more than 250 years, accompanied by wildfires. And swimmers in both Sweden and Poland are being warned of toxic algae spread by hot weather. Let's talk about Belgium. The heat wave there is blamed for causing road accidents. And northern latitude countries worldwide are facing their hottest summers in history. Dozens of Japanese died of heat-related conditions in the past 3 months as temperatures topped 40 degrees. South Korea had record-breaking highs this week. 52 degrees was recorded in California's Death Valley last month. And the temperature in Carey in Oman has never sank below 43 degrees in June. The heat waves blamed for causing wildfires across northern Europe. High temperatures and weeks of drought contributed to major wildfires, forest fires that is, in Sweden and in neighboring Norway as well, following its hottest recorded temperature in May. Forests in Latvia were torched, and the border between Finland and Russia was closed because of fires there. All right, let's bring in our panel now. Joining me here in the studio is Rob McElwee, a familiar face to our viewers. Is a meteorologist and weather forecaster here at Al Jazeera. In Reading in the UK, Rowan Sutton, Director of Climate Research at the UK National Centre for Atmospheric Science at the University of Reading. And in Malmö in Sweden, Bjorn Lomborg, President of the Copenhagen Consensus, a Danish-based think tank. Welcome to all of you. Rob, I'm going to start with you. I know people may say we're playing favorites, but you're in the studio. And the question I want to put to you is, why is this happening?
Well, set it against the background of climate change anywhere, where we expect everything to get slowly warmer. As a general, I mean, the atmosphere is holding more warmth, as is the ocean. But in the past, probably when you and I were children, we expect the weather to move around, such that we got a day of rain, a couple of days of sunshine, and then it would rain again. So that is a moving pattern. The weather patterns tend to move around the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. We're talking about the Northern Hemisphere summer now. But what seems to have happened, well, what obviously has happened this year, is the movement has stopped. So in any one place, you get persistence of a type of weather. If you have, and you may have heard this expression, a blocking high, a blocking anticyclone, which is a dome of air that won't move, everything else goes around it. So if you're underneath the dome, and we have been in parts of Europe, then you get clear skies, and in the height of summer, days and days of insolation, and the ground warms up and the temperatures rise, as they do by night. We've had some record-breaking warm nights as well. Mm-hmm. If this persists, of course, you get what we've currently got. And if it persists all around the Northern Hemisphere, you get heat waves. But what we haven't mentioned is the consequent, rather poor weather, for example, in Bulgaria, poor summer, plenty of rain, and persistent rains given flooding in the eastern side of the US. So it's persistence of type because the weather pattern has been blocked from moving around. That's, I think, the reason for the current outbreaks.
Rowan, was this predictable?
The details of what's happened this summer certainly were not predicted. It may actually be that they were predictable some months ahead. That's a research area. What was predictable, though, was, and indeed predicted, was the increased frequency of heat waves. That's been predicted for decades by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for example. And I think your summary highlighted nicely what's really outstanding about this summer is not that we just have it warm in Europe, but that we've seen records falling from California all the way to Japan. So what climate change does is increase the likelihood of events like this. It doesn't tell us when we're going to get one particular year or the next, but it increases the likelihood very significantly.
Bjorn, I saw you nodding. Did you want to get in and comment on that as well?
No, I totally agree. I mean, this is what the science tells us, and it's not very surprising. As temperatures rise, you're going to see more heat waves, and that's exactly what we're seeing now.
So if that's the case, if situations like this, or at least somewhat predictable, how exactly do you prepare for them? And we'll get to trying to prevent it later. First and foremost, how would you even begin to prepare for something like this, Bjorn?
Well, there's a number of things we need to recognize. One is that the major reason why more people are suffering for heat is actually not global warming as much as it's the fact that many more people live in dense cities, which have lots of asphalt, lots of buildings that soak up the heat.
Did you say
so, for
dense
instance,
cities?
you mentioned Tokyo. So, sorry, you mentioned Tokyo, and what we've seen is that global warming has probably increased temperatures in Tokyo about 1 degree, but urban heat, the urban heat signature has actually increased at about 2 degrees. And so it's important to recognize that global warming is part of the problem, but another part of the problem, and one where we can do a lot more, a lot faster, is really about the fact that we all live in cities now and that we can do something about making them cooler.
Rowan, do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I do agree with that. Of course, it is the two things coming together that is particularly dangerous. And of course, looking to the future, the planet is going to carry on warming at least for some decades, quite likely for more than that. And so we have to work out how to adapt to these conditions, and adapting our cities is absolutely a priority. There are many things that can be done there. Shading buildings is one simple example. But in fact, there are many aspects of adaptation that we really haven't started to look at seriously.
Rob, these heat waves, things as such, are they happening more often now?
I'm not sure if they're happening more often. I mean, they are, as has been said already, they're consistent with what the climate models have suggested, that when they happen, they become more extreme. And that's true of heat waves, floods, and indeed the intensity of storms. But if we're going to get more blocking in the general movement, which appears to be the case, then the chances are that they will become more frequent, in that one year you'll get this, and the next year you might get it about 15 degrees further around, so you'll get a permanent wet year. So in any one place, an event either of flooding or heat is likely to be, I think, more likely, because we don't get the movement.
I want to ask you about 2003. That was the year that thousands of people died from the heat across Europe. Are there things in play that could create something like that again?
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, the difference between 2003 and 2018 is probably less than a degree, and persistence probably was about the same. I don't have the detail in my mind, but one of the things we haven't mentioned only briefly is it's not so much the daytime heat, it's the increased humidity. In places in Europe, usually it's a more humid heat than it might be, for example, in Africa or here in the Middle East. We get 48 degrees every year, and it's like a blast furnace, but it's dry heat. If you have higher humidity and the nighttime cooling keeps your temperature at the middle 20s or early 30s, and it's humid, that's what tends to kill people.
And Rowan, that's a great point that you bring up, Rowan. I wanted to bring that in. We were having this discussion actually this morning. Obviously, we are in a very warm climate here in Doha, and people here don't have the same interaction or reaction to the warm temperatures that clearly other people in other countries have. Could you talk more about why it affects different people in different parts of the world differently?
Well, that's right. Of course, in every part of the world, people have developed ways of living that are adapted to the climate that they're used to. In the Mediterranean, people like to have a siesta. In the UK, that's not so common. And that's why climate change is a challenge to us, because we have to change quite a lot of our habits. And it also is one of the reasons why actually, a heat wave which is not familiar can be quite dangerous, because people don't have the kind of habits that they have in warmer countries in terms of how they respond to hot weather, and so it is a big challenge. In the UK, we've seen big problems on the tube, on the underground transport system, for example. When it gets very hot, people don't bring enough water with them, really basic things, but these can be really rather dangerous.
Bjorn, when we're talking about people changing habits, is it more difficult to get individual people to change habits, or a government or a country? Like, where do you start to get people to understand and to process that they have to be proactive about this?
Well, very clearly, it's something that everyone has an advantage in actually adapting to. So Rowan is absolutely right. This is a question of, people in Helsinki are well adapted to their climate, and people in Rome and Greece are well adapted to their much hotter climate, and you in Doha are even warmer. But what we all need to recognize is that we're moving a little bit south in that sense. It's getting a little hotter, and we need those structures. But we also need to recognize two things. We have the technology. If you look, for instance, at the US, compared to most other places around the world, the US has dramatically increased its population, especially in the South and the Southwest. So people have moved in droves to Florida, to Arizona, those kinds of places where it's incredibly hot. But actually, heat deaths have declined. Why? Because they have air conditioning. So really, the simple solution is to get much more availability of air conditioning. It's also all these other things, as Rowan mentioned, shading. It's about getting smarter building structures so you don't heat up as much, get more ventilation, get more water movement. There's a lot of smart, simple things that you can do. But in reality, this is about making sure that we invest in these technologies. And you see this every summer. People run out and buy a fan, but increasingly they need to go out and actually buy air conditioning.
We are going to pivot to prevention and really dealing with climate change head on in just a moment. Before we do that, though, Rob, I want to ask you something. When you say 1 degree, that doesn't necessarily mean a lot if we're talking about here in the studio. But tell us why 1 degree really is a lot.
Well, if you're talking about 1 degree from the point of view of a changing climate, that represents an extra amount of energy that's gone into the entire system, the air and the ground. It comes out, though, I remember when I first really noticed the changing climate was in the middle 90s at an El Nino year, when the temperatures in India the records being broken by 2, 3 or 4 degrees. Now, up until that point, if you broke a temperature record, it was by 0.1 or 0.2. So it was a rare event. Okay. To break a record by 3 or 4 degrees was unprecedented, unheard of. So I thought, well, this isn't just El Nino. There's something else going on here. And this is what we're seeing. We've seen most years since that records in any one place are broken by more than a degree, a significant amount. Now, that's a reflection of a local concentration of a general increase in the amount of energy available. And we've seen it again now with this persistence of type. You get an increase in temperatures slowly day by day, but you end up breaking a record by quite a large amount.
Okay. Rowan, the Arctic is warming at a much greater rate than the rest of the world. What does that mean?
Yeah, so the Arctic is a very important region. And of course, the melting of the ice there has had a lot of publicity. That's important, of course, for people that live close to the Arctic, but it's also an important indicator of how the planet and the climate system as a whole is changing. And in fact, it would be fair to say we don't know what the full consequences would be. So as the ocean becomes increasingly exposed to the atmosphere, that has the potential to change ocean circulation in ways that could affect large parts of the planet. That's an area of active research. There are other things in the Arctic that are very important. The melting of the permafrost is another issue that there is concern about, because that could be a positive feedback on climate change, potentially leading to increases in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from this feedback that would then accelerate global warming. So the Arctic is a key region, and we have to watch it very closely. And indeed, from a science point of view, we have to continue to study the consequences of those Arctic changes.
Bjorn, we talked a minute ago a lot about, how to deal with heat and air conditioning and the way we build things, et cetera, et cetera. But what about reversing these things? What about stopping these things? People have sounded the alarm about this for quite some time. Is it actually sinking in?
Well, first of all, it's very clearly sinking in the sense that we've seen dramatically reducing death rates in the US. So this is very much a question of availability of cheap technologies to avoid it. So it's both about having access to air conditioning and having access to cheap electricity. There's also another thing that I think is
I'm not talking about dealing with something when we're already hot. I'm talking about preventing the things that are causing this.
So can we do something about global warming? We can, but we also need to be honest and say this is going to be half to a full century of pretty dramatic effort, and it's only going to reduce the rate of increase. So we're still going to see an increase in temperature, but what we can do is see a slightly lower increase of temperature, and then maybe towards the end of the century, a reduction of temperature. So the reality is we're going to see global warming with us for quite a while. And that's why I'm arguing we need to recognize that a very large part of what we're going to do with heat deaths is going to be with adaptation. Yes, we should also focus on cutting carbon emissions. And that we can really only do, and we've seen that, for instance, with the Paris Agreement, where everybody has stepped up and promised to do a lot of stuff, but it's actually not happening very much because it's very expensive for most nations. The only way to get most nations to switch away from fossil fuels is by making green energy sources so cheap that you don't have to subsidize them, but that everybody will want to get to them. And that's through innovation.
Okay, Rob, I want to be more optimistic and think that we can do something about this, that this is reversible. Is it? Am I being naive?
Well, we can do anything eventually. I mean, theoretically, you could sequester the CO2 back into the rocks, for example, but the energy cost in doing that might well mean that the amount of energy you have to use to create the pumps to do it emit more CO2 anyway. So there's no easy fix, and we've already built into what we've already put into the atmosphere at least 2 degrees warming, and probably more than that. And there's no sign that we're reducing in line with what we need from the Paris Accord, for example, to get us to a sensible place. So we've got to make the assumption that these things will keep getting worse and worse year upon year, whatever we do. But as Bjorn said, I mean, there are options that the route that we can go down, and we are going down. Let's be honest, there's good production of energy from renewable sources. Big solar array in Morocco, for example. The UK can produce 100% of its necessary energy or its demand on days in the summer because of either solar or wind catching. So we're going down that route, even though it's too slow. But we've already built in heat that we haven't yet experienced. This is not going to be the hottest heat wave.
Thanks, Rob.
Sorry.
So, Rowan, let me ask you, as Bjorn brought up the Paris Climate Accord, of which the U.S. is no longer actively a part of, how much of a difference, how much do we need big countries like the U.S. to push this and to get other countries to do this? Or was it just mostly on paper? What is actually being done?
Okay, so the Paris Agreement was a very significant landmark. Now, it's a difficult issue because, as Bjorn said, at some level, whatever we do, we're going to get quite a bit more warming. But it would be wrong for people to be fatalistic about that. We've had a 1 degree of warming, roughly, since the 19th century. And it really is up to us whether we get 2 degrees more or 3 degrees more or 4 degrees more over the next couple of hundred years. You know, that's quite a long time. The decisions that we take, though, in the next few decades will determine whether we get another 1 or 2 or 4 degrees of extra warming. And that really matters. You know, we need to limit future warming, of course, not just for our own generation, but for our children's and grandchildren's generations. So it really is very important to invest in that part of the problem. And the Paris Agreement was a very important step, but only one step. It doesn't put in place anything like enough. So that agreement needs to be strengthened.
So about that, let me ask you that.
A landmark in the right direction.
So about that agreement, should it be governments driving this, or should it be businesses driving it because they have the incentive to make it work, to make money?
It has to be both. I mean, the falling price of renewables has been a very positive story, and we hope that goes on. And of course, business has been central to that. On the other hand, governments can make a big difference in terms of putting incentives towards reducing the cost of renewables and indeed other actions that will reduce greenhouse gases. So it needs to be both.
Bjorn, you know, you've been talking a lot about this from a business angle, which it makes sense. I mean, these things are only going to happen if people have some sort of financial incentive to be proactive about it. But so much of what's happening is also creating economically internally displaced people. Like there are people who are losing their businesses because of flooding or because there's not enough water for their crops. Or can you talk about it from that perspective, how it makes a lot of sense to get in ahead of this because it's actually going to end up being damaging to your country, to your bottom line in the end?
Well, and unfortunately, I'm not going to give you quite as easy a picture as what you were just framing, because clearly there are people who are going to be displaced. There are people who are going to be hit by more hurricanes or by increasing water levels and so on. That is a definite cost. On the other hand, you also have to look at what is the cost of, for instance, trying to implement the Paris Agreement or even stronger agreements, as we were just talking about. And those also have costs because you're basically making energy more expensive, at least in the short and medium run. And so it's really about weighing those two. That means you should do something, which basically means you should make energy a little more expensive, but you should not make it phenomenally more expensive. Because what happens is if you make it phenomenally more expensive, you reduce global warming impacts a little bit, but you induce extra costs in the economy that are much, much bigger. So it really is a balancing act. And we have not been very good at getting to that. In some ways, we're under-taxing CO2 emissions. So vast amounts of the world do not tax CO2 at all. In other places, for instance, in cars in my native country in Denmark, but many other places, and specific instances, we overtax them dramatically. And so we have a very uneven structure that's in some way built more on populism and feel-good environmentalism rather than actually focusing on how do we deal with this. But the real measure, and just let me say this very briefly, is to recognize what is the only real thing that's going to drive this. That's innovation. If you look at what happened with the U.S. shale gas revolution back in the late 2000s, what the U.S. managed to do through technology was to make gas much cheaper. So they basically switched away from a lot of coal towards gas. That matters a lot because it cuts carbon emissions by half. What really happened was the U.S. has been the hugest reduction in CO2 over the last 10 years. Not because they were particularly environmentally friendly, but simply because they found a better, cheaper energy technology. That's the kind of thing that we need to drive, because if we can make green energy cheaper, everyone will want it.
Okay, Bjorn, just a minute. Rob, I know you wanted to get in on this discussion.
I just wondered, Bjorn, if this is always true, because we tackle this worldwide by looking at the financial cost of any particular change. And if it's too expensive to offset the cost of a change in the climate, then it's not done. It seems to be driven by financial costs. But rarely do we use the whole Earth sum. I mean, how much energy, for example, does it cost to extract coal versus extracting fracked gas versus the amount of CO2 that's eventually given off when the inefficient burning of coal is compared with the inefficient burning of gas? That's a sum that we don't tend to use because that's more of a scientific sum, and everything is driven by the financial cost. And I'm not sure that eventually that's going to be the real way of doing things.
Look, very, very briefly, and that's a very scientific conversation. I totally agree with you. We should be looking at what's the absolute amount, not just what's the financial impact. I was trying to talk about social cost and social benefits. So these are the kind of costs that we all carry, not just businesses. Yeah.
Okay. Gentlemen, I think that was scientific enough, I think, but I do want you to have the final word though on this, Rob. What don't we know? What are the things that smart scientists like you, for all the things that we've learned, what are like the small things that you still wish we knew the answers to that could help fill this whole picture in?
It's a big thing, really. I don't know. I don't know as much as Rowan knows. And the one thing I don't know, I know that the Arctic ice does not any longer cover the Arctic Sea, so we don't get the cold northern winter, which therefore disrupts the pattern. And that stops things moving, hence our cold winter. But I don't know why that has lasted into this summer, for example. The pattern is still not moving, the weather patterns. I think it's a consequence of the Arctic ice, but I don't know why. So I would just like to know that.
And we will discuss that. But gentlemen, thank you so much for the discussion we've had today. Really appreciate it. You made it very accessible for scientists, non-scientists rather, that are watching. Thank you very much. All right, Rob, right here in the studio, Rowan Sutton and Bjorn Lomborg. Thank you for watching. You can watch the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And also you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team. Bye for now.